American migrants, particularly children and young families who have migrated in enormous numbers over the last several years. To give you a sense of the scope of this migration, in 2009 about 3,300 children unaccompanied came in from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And by 2014 that figure had jumped to 51,000 people, unaccompanied kids, with another 16,000 unaccompanied children from Mexico. In addition, in 2014, 68,000 people in family units from those three states migrated to the United States, 68,000. In fiscal year 2015, we saw still large-scale migration, but a number of people being intercepted in Mexico and also being intercepted in Guatemala to a smaller extent. This human crisis, I think, has highlighted in a very dramatic way the connection between economic development, between the rule of law, and between migration. And it's also raised the pressing question of how to provide these children and young families with a level of security and a level of opportunity that would allow them to stay at home and to thrive at home. Last year, the Northern Triangle nations, those three nations, in collaboration with the Inter-American Development Bank, produced a roadmap to address their economic, social, and rule of law challenges. It's called the Plan of the Alliance for Prosperity for the Northern Triangle. It's not a plan about stemming illegal migration, but it's a plan about creating opportunity, security, and prosperity in these states. However, of course, it certainly has implications for migration. We're very grateful to have Juan Ricardo Ortega, the operations principal advisor of the Inter-American Development Bank, with us today to discuss the plan. So thank you for coming from DC. Mr. Ortega is a leading specialist at the Department of Institutional Capacity in the finance sector at the Inter-American Development Bank. He studied economics at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota and has a master's degree in development economics and did doctoral studies at Yale University. Among other positions, Mr. Ortega is former director of DION, the Colombian tax agency, where he is credited with having fought corruption and considerably increased tax revenues, which is a big part of the development. For our present purposes, he was centrally involved in developing this plan for the Alliance for Prosperity. And after his talk, obviously we're running a little bit behind and we're up against lunch at 12:30, but after his talk, we will try to have a few questions. So let me turn it over to him now and thank him again for joining us.
Thank you so much, Donald, and thank you for the Center of Migration Studies. We highly appreciate the opportunity of being here. I think this is an enormous opportunity for U.S. scholars and people interested in the subject to have one experiment that is going to be beginning next year, where a lot of data is going to be collected, and with your help, probably could be one of the areas of study that would allow for people to understand what are the interlinks of security, development, and migration. So it's a great opportunity to be able to briefly fly through the slides, and we'll leave them here for anybody that wants to go into detail. But this is something that the countries came together after that large migration of unaccompanied children. And people began to discuss what can be done to change the current situation in these three nations. And what they realized is the conditions were not right. You had very low growth. Since 2008, all these three countries are everything's very close to 1% or zero growth per year. They have a very large percent of population in poverty. Guatemala is one of the countries with the largest excluded population in the world. They suffer a lot of disasters, volcanoes, earthquakes, hurricanes. And one of the most worrisome statistics is 40% of their children are out of school. There is no coverage for secondary school. And if you look at the data, children between 14 and 25, 30% are out of school and without a job. So they are just out there in the streets. So you don't have probably the best welcoming environment to develop children's life. And when you look at what goes on, this is very young societies. If they haven't gone through a population transition yet. Guatemala is still between 5 and 6 children per woman. And 65% of the population is below 30. They have dramatic rates of adolescent pregnancy. One of the largest in the world. Guatemala is among the 20 largest. 91 pregnancies, women between 15 and 20 out of 100,000. Much larger than Central American average of 75 and the double of the world's poorest countries, which is 45. And they have the highest homicide rates. Honduras was last year the country with the most homicide, 100 per 100,000. And it's very likely Salvador is going to be the one overtaking that unfortunate position this coming year. And 10% of the population have migrated, and most of the people is considering that as an option. And this is where the statistics that were shown. Last year there was 71,000 unaccompanied children that migrated. Some of them were detained in Mexico, others in the US frontier, which were the data that Donald mentioned. But if you look at this year's data, the numbers are not as positive as they've been shown. Although figures decreased dramatically in the US, things have grown quite a lot in the southern Mexican frontier. And we're still at 61,931. And the figures are growing. The Niño effect, the climate change, both in Guatemala, Honduras have had a horrible dry season, and the rural areas are struggling dramatically. So you are very likely to see those figures growing. So you have to find a comprehensive approach to solve this, and what the three countries realize is the economies are too small to attract investment. They are next to Mexico, which is huge, and have very aggressive strategies to attract investment with no taxes and all kind of free tax zones. So they needed to work together in order for them to offer employment, which is considered one of the key variables, and for them to be able to develop their human capital. They decided to create an alliance and to try to solve some of their issues together. But they needed help, and they need help from donors, and the US is the one offering one of the major sources of cooperation. It's very likely that the bill that is going to be approved by Congress on the 11th will have close to $700 million on aid for the three countries for this plan. And hopefully it's going to be maintained. At least there is a commitment for 5 years, but there are talks that this is a long-term approach, so it could go to 10 or 15 years if things were to done right. There's going to be a lot of conditionality, and I'm going to go into details, and that's why civil society and the private sector are going to be key in order for everybody to be following up that they do deliver what they've promised. And that's some of the key principles. This cannot be just aid for aid's sake. There has to be some significant changes in the institutionality within the countries that guarantee efficiency, participation at the local level, at the government level, even at the international level with the civil society. There has to be the territorial approach. There were a lot of studies trying to find which were the territories where the most impact could be had with these investments. So there's going to be data where there's going to be coordinated intervention with the United States help on security, particularly strengthening policing. And there's going to be coordination with the USAID on crime prevention. And there is going to be coordination with the government resources in order to build schools and health facilities and centers to attend women that are victims of domestic violence, which is one of the key sources of violence in the region. So there's going to be monitoring and evaluation, and that's probably one of the roles the bank is going to be helping with. But we have to develop institutional capacity, and that's where donors and countries that are willing to help are going to be instrumental in order for these countries to raise the level of their procurement systems in order to be able to deliver. So as you see, we're trying to kind of like have a comprehensive plan that has high impact. And the key is going to be, obviously, as always, in the implementation, and that is going to be beginning January next year. We have already defined the territories. That information is public, which is going to be quite useful for the experiments that anybody wants to follow to look at control areas and how behavior on the migration statistics changes based upon where the interventions take place. We are developing an engagement document with the civil society that we are beginning to pass along as a draft for the moment, but it's going to be public probably within the next month. And we are working with the countries on how we're going to raise the standards on the execution of the resources. So here is the strategy very briefly. First, there is the need to develop human capital. We have to be able to show that there is going to be a change in the state, in the ability to raise the level of their citizens. And for that, they need public safety. security environment is not adequate. There is quite a lot of violence, and children face a pretty complex environment. So for that, you need an independent, strong judicial system. And that's one of the key areas of conditionality, and where the countries have to put a lot of emphasis, strengthening their judicial systems, and that's one area of hard work. And if you have that, we believe the environment to gain productive investment will change, and that would allow for people who are in the diaspora that have migrated to be able to invest and to go back to their countries and to attract foreign direct investment. But for that, you need the three countries to work united. They don't have enough infrastructure, not a large enough economy to be able to compete with Mexico, which is right next to them. And finally, and not least important, they need their own resources. These three countries have very low tax collection as a percentage of GDP rates. Guatemala is at 10%, which is probably one of the lowest in the world. And you are not able to build state if you are not able to collect taxes. But you need to go deeper than that in order to be able to strengthen institutions. So this is kind of like what we believe is a comprehensive approach that could somehow create that forthcoming environment to gain development around this difficult migration environment they are facing. So this is very briefly what we're going to do. Developing human capital, there is a large investment on the part of the countries on vocational and technical training. Obviously, they have to increase their secondary schooling coverage, and they have to change the current approach that only half-day classes are offered in order to offer a complete day attendance for the children, so they are not out there in the streets. They have to invest dramatically in healthcare, particularly for women at the moment of childbirth. There is clear statistics in the case of Guatemala that malnutrition, because women are not attending to pregnancy, is one of the major sources of children's poor results in school attendance and schooling. And you have to be able to attend the return migrants. And for that, they have to develop projects in order to go forward in these different pillars. In order to be able to offer these children a future, you need a productive sector that is competitive. And for that, it's very clear that the energy cost in the region is very high. So the energy integration of the three countries is going to be key. Getting access to gas from Mexico, which is probably one of the most competitive sources of energy in the region, is one of the key investments that is likely to take place. They need to invest in logistics in order for them to be able to be competitive, and particularly, as I said, with Mexico right next to them. And they need to get private investment. The level of private investment in Salvador and Guatemala is just below 15%, which is incredibly low, and there's no way for them to be able to create jobs if they don't reach a 25% level of investment as a percentage of the GDP. And there are some strategic sectors like tourism that need some probably specific strategies in order for them to be competitive. For that, as I said, you need institutions, and there is a pretty strong emphasis on the part of the United States on the independence and strength of the judicial system. You've seen with Guatemala what CICIG has accomplished, and CICIG has been a check mechanism that is very effective. If some of you don't know what CICIG is, it's an institution that is funded by the United Nations, and it's an investigative unit that is able to prosecute people for corruption and crimes against the state. And the former president has just been toppled because he's been involved in a major corruption scandal with the customs. So they need to be able to fight organized crime, and that is one of the issues in my mind of major concern. The region is a victim probably of what went on in Colombia with Plan Colombia, and organized crime has migrated to Central America. And that makes figures quite troublesome. You mentioned a lot about remittances, and in my mind, that's one source of a lot of concern. What I saw in Colombia, remittances are one of the key instruments used for money launderers. So remittances can be virtuous when they go into investment and they increase people's families' income, but when they are the ones funneled in order to launder the money of organized crime, things could be different. And if you look at the growth of remittances in Guatemala, I cannot imagine that can be explained for any economic variable or migration that has happened in the recent years. Only money laundering from drug dealers, in my mind, can explain some of those variables. So you have a huge challenge in the region regarding organized crime and the ability to undermine this whole system. And for that, you need to change the approach with the prison centers. It's quite clear that for these children, going to prison is not a deterrent. Actually, kind of like it's a PhD in order for them to go up into the skeletons of organized crime. So you need to begin to think out of the box on how this kind of crime should be treated, and how can you bring some change in these communities with these children going to jail so young. And for that, there is going to be a large investment in community security programs. You have to change the approach, creating safe houses, women's houses, in order to be able to offer different strategies in order to attack the problems as crime prevention and not just as punishment. And women and youth at risk are the #1 priority. And finally, the transparency strategy is going to be working on strengthening the tax and customs administrations. These countries have to be able to ramp up their tax collection in a significant way if they want to make this whole strategy sustainable. That takes quite a lot, both politically and managerially. Their tax administrations have been weakened, a lot of it because of the same organized crime that is affecting the region. They are pursuing a customs union, which we believe will enhance opportunities for investment in the 3 countries, and for that they have to implement major institutional changes, coordinating their customs administrations and both their taxations. They have to change their laws for procurement and supervision. They have to strengthen their control office and their procurement laws. And for that, they're working in some of the countries with Transparency International in order to be able to raise those standards. And they have to improve the quality of the public sector, at least gradually, beginning with the judicial system, developing strong civil services. So this is what they've committed themselves. And they are already presented their first budgets for the 2016 fiscal year. There is a commitment of $2.8 billion, which is a significant amount. It's written 2.4, but at the time of this presentation, the budgets have already been presented, so the figure is a little bit larger. We have to develop the framework by which they're going to execute those monies and the way for civil society to follow up on their commitment. And this is going to be complemented with the $700 million that are likely to be approved by the US Congress. So this kind of like allows you to get an idea of what they are going to be doing during the next 5 years. And we hope to be able to set this framework and for them to be able to coordinate with the partners, with the political processes, which is going to be quite a challenge. There are some big reforms that will need to take place, and we'll see if we manage the political will through the next year and the US conditionality. So this is what we hope to get: economic growth based on security, stronger states, and that being the source of opportunity that will keep the children in their home countries. And for you to remember, the whole thing is that you have very young population out there, and there's quite a lot of risk, so it's worth making it. Thank you so much.
So we'll take some questions, but I'd like to ask just a couple of questions, and particularly on the indictment of President Lima. Does that inspire confidence among donors, or does it undermine confidence among donors? I'm curious about that. And also this issue of, since we're about migration, international migration, how does U.S. migration policies fit into this plan, if at all, whether contributing to it or undermining it? And please, questions from you all too. So.
What do you think? One of your questions, I'll try to answer these two, which aren't easy at all. What we've seen is probably quite a positive response on the part of the international community regarding the rule of law in Guatemala. Many people see it as the opportunity to implement all the agreements in the peace process and to finally get things done. It is quite impressive that you get the president, the vice president, some ministers, all of them indicted and in jail for the moment, without no violence. There was nobody being killed. There was one murder that is particularly complicated, that is the defense lawyer of Rios Montt, which is, so things are still happening. But you saw the prosecutor, the Ministerio Público, being able to bring forward the prosecution of a president and getting so much civil society pressure and public pressure that Congress allowed for that to happen. And that's something that probably most people never imagined could occur, because the corruption is at the Congress and the political parties, and they were under so much pressure from the young people in Guatemala that went out into the streets to protest that they did make the decisions. Now you're going to be at the critical point. They just elected a new president, someone with no political experience, who's going to be facing a very complex environment. So it's going to be a lot on the support he gets and the ability of him being able to build a competent team of people that helps him manage the country. That is still to be seen, and that's going to be probably the critical thing in the coming months. So that's regarding Guatemala. The U.S. policy obviously affects a lot of what is happening. As you've seen the statistics, a lot of children have migrated and only 2,000 of them have been sent back. So the rule of law in the United States and the rights of these children to go in front of a judge and ask for refugee status, if it is the case of all the different immigration categories that they can apply to, clearly signals in the region that if they come to the U.S., they will stay at least for 5, 6, 7 years. That is common knowledge. It has been advertised on the radio. So if you don't change conditions in the ground significantly, you are going to keep seeing that migration happening because of the United States current regulation. And that's probably why the U.S. put so much emphasis on Mexico, to try to fill the gap and stop them there where it seems conditions are not as stringent regarding the due process of law with these children, but I know that the human rights organizations, NGOs, are putting quite a lot of pressure on trying to see what is going on in Mexico. And I don't know for how long Mexico is going to be able to keep deporting so many children without all the necessary due process of law for them to know if they do satisfy a refugee status or not. For what I've seen, there is a case that is being documented by Sonia Nazario of almost 90 of those children being killed when they've been deported from Mexico. So there is a scandal being built that is going to be putting a lot of pressure on what is going on with these children. So I think things are going to get complicated as time goes by.
Questions? Yep. Kathy?
Thank you. It's very hopeful to see the blueprint, but the first thing when you said the U.S. would be helpful to the police forces in the different countries, I gasped, because the history of the United States in Central America since, let's say, 54 in Guatemala, let's say 2008 with the U.S. tacit support, if not active support, of our military in the deposing of Zelaya, the president of the country, and his extradition outside the state, in the face of a huge and growing civil society effort to bring about constitutional reforms, supposedly the same type of reforms that you would be supporting now, that the plan would be supporting now. So, and the whole history of the United States in the civil defense, supporting the civil defense authorities in Guatemala that were often part and parcel of their own militaries massacring indigenous populations. Is this really being supported by the grassroots and the civil societies as a strategy? And what are the protections for these potential, for a replay of this scenario?
Take some more questions.
Take maybe a couple more questions, yeah.
Thank you for being here. The issue of the Mexican interdictions is quite an issue. I mean, El Salvador is receiving record rates of children being returned this year, about 5,000 or so. And there's no screening mechanisms of note in Mexico where children have a valid opportunity to obtain asylum. They have to remain in detention, so most of them are returned without any protections. Is there anything that can be done from your perspective to leverage Mexico and some of the other nations in the region to improve their protection regimes so there can be a regional protection system as opposed to a regional enforcement system as well? And my second question, sorry, is on the aid, it was $1 billion and it was cut, and a lot of what was cut would go to youth development and to reintegration programs. So a lot of it will be going to enforcement, which some of us might think is counterproductive. So could you respond to that as well?
Maybe one more question? Keep waiting for an easy question here, too.
Hi, I'm Carmen Makino with Catholic Charities, Long Island. When you mentioned about 10% of maybe the population, and let's say in this case El Salvador, which are the largest number of unaccompanied minors that we are receiving on Long Island, that is when you mentioned the country as a whole, right? However, most of the children are coming from the same region. Also, this is the same region that had the problems before with the Civil War. Is the part of the country where they don't have 2 harvests per year. They only have 1 because of the weather conditions. So I don't think it's 10%, those are just the numbers that we know of, but the numbers are much, much larger. So that means that this region of El Salvador is being left without that generation, that youth that is going to be needed in order to implement this program, right? You're leaving the country without a generation, and we didn't have one before because of the Civil War. So by making cuts to where it's really needed, the children, when I see the chart, it's just 1 more bucks a month is at the equal footing as the others. However, we know that the problem has become much larger than the others.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Let me begin with the police question and finish with the children. There is a very, I would say, significant change in the U.S. approach regarding security. And it's coming from the U.S., probably based on all the evaluations that have been carried out that have shown that current approaches have definitely not been successful. So they are trying to implement something different this time. And that's why I said if there is enough research along this whole effort, probably we could learn quite a lot of lessons. So they are trying to implement this thing called base place approach, where they're looking at some very specific areas where there are clear statistics of violence, for example, homicide rates, and they choose those areas and they implement strategy, training, what they're calling community policing, trying to change the way police works away from a militaristic approach. And it's one of the conditionalities of the US Congress, and it's written in the State Department's law that they want to demilitarize the police, and that is coming from the NGOs, from the civil society. They have very strong influence in the Senate, and they have gotten language in the legislation that is putting pressure on the State Department and INL in particular in changing that approach. This hasn't happened yet, so I cannot foresee how it's going to turn out, but I've been in the meetings, and that they are definitely trying to work all together. So they have their prevention programs in place where they have their enhancements of the police capabilities. They are choosing some key municipalities, the ones that are critical, and they're going to be focusing all the effort in those municipalities, trying to get all the indicators followed up in order to gain evidence of what is working and what is not. So it's going to be a learning by doing process, because it's kind of like a long-term strategy. And now we are in the process of trying to bring the governments in order for them to coordinate their efforts in those same areas, for them to build the school and to increase the amount of time for the children in school in order to get them out of the streets. So if we were able, and we get enough research behind it, we could probably learn quite a lot of what works and what doesn't. But this is just, as you saw, it's a blueprint and it's a plan. Everything is going to be judged by how it is implemented. And that's where probably the biggest challenges are going to be. I can see a significant change in the US approach, away from just weapons and helicopters and guns, and mostly on management and information management and data sets and systems. They are bringing the one that was developed in New York, I believe is named CompSat, which is the police strategic managerial system, and that's the kind of expenses that are going to be carried out and the trainings that are going to be taking place in those municipalities and within municipality sectors that are going to be focused. So I hope that kind of like answers your question. Regarding the Mexican one, there is a lot of voices that are being raised as of now, just asking what you are asking. And I believe it's going to be civil society and that same influence in the US Congress, the one that is going to balance the current situation. The US is the one funding the Mexican strategy, so it's going to be played out in the US Congress, how you even those out. If there are enough voices that want that due process of law to be the one that has the higher weight, or the one that wants the children stopped before they reach the US frontier. I don't think that the budget cut is going to be affecting necessarily the youth programs. We don't know that, and if you know the US budget process, we will not know any of that until probably late next year, when they reach an agreement between the State Department, the White House, and Congress through this very complicated budget management process that I don't fully comprehend. But I know that the law is not enough. There has to be a specific RX whatever 16 number document that is secret, that is the one that allows for the specific mandate for the money to be liberated by the US Congress in order for that money to be spent. We'll know that late next year. We have strong hopes that the crime prevention and youth programs are going to be the ones that are going to be benefited the most. And that's where a lot of the talk is taking place, and this police strengthening component. Those are going to be the two that are going to be driving probably the budget allocation. But it's too early to know. We need first to get the budget approved before the 11th of December. And last but not least, regarding El Salvador. There is a lot of data on the municipalities where the children are living from, and there is a lot of emphasis to invest in those municipalities. Those were the ones being focused. In the case of El Salvador, most of the violence is happening in 60 out of the 200 and something municipalities. And that's where some of the big investments are going to be taking place, trying to keep the children there. And for that to happen, what is believed in El Salvador, the emphasis is going to be in protecting the mothers. And then Las Casas de la Mujer is one of the building blocks of the Salvadorian strategy. There is a very positive outcome out of Salud Mesoamerica, particularly in El Salvador. And that's something that people probably should learn about and realize that things are happening that are significant institutional changes. There is just an evaluation of Salud Mesoamerica carried out by the Bill Gates Foundation. So it's very reliable data. They've kept a lot of data through the last years that they've been implemented it. And in El Salvador, they see a dramatic change in the management of health resources and the ability of the health system to attend, particularly women. So there are things that are happening that are somehow kept out of the media. No, the murder rate is the one that takes all the headlines. But I can clearly tell you that regarding education and health, El Salvador is doing really pretty good job, and is very committed and has capable people carrying it out. And what the people from the Bill Gates Foundation told us, this is not something that I have verified myself, but the people who spoke was incredibly reliable, is that by the interaction with the institutions that were monitoring and following the management of Salud Mesoamerica, which was a grant program in order to achieve some outcomes in healthcare provisions, they say that the culture changed dramatically and that people are a lot more conscious, they want to learn, they got new contacts, and that has created a new dynamic in the Salvadorian health system that they had not even foreseen before the whole thing started. And they actually want to push much farther in Salud Mesoamerica in order to go ahead in the new round. And that is kind of the same story that's going to be applied to the judicial system. They want to raise that same kind of consciousness and self-esteem of the judges in the region in order for them to gain independence and to get a voice, which they don't have at the moment. And if they have the support, and they have the US institutions behind them, we strongly believe that they will make a claim and gain the status and the checks and balances that at the moment the countries are not experiencing. So what I've seen, probably most of the things that one would like to see are happening regarding transparency and strengthening of institutions. The one that we are lagging is tax collection. And that's where probably the biggest challenge lays ahead, because the very wealthy people are extremely powerful, and they haven't given a signal yet that they're going to allow themselves to be taxed as they should. But that's something where the international community can always play a role as well. It did in the case of Colombia. I was the Deputy Secretary of Finance, and when Plan Colombia came about, the wealthiest Colombians were not paying much taxes, and the United States probably called them up and told them they would want to see more collaborative approach to the whole strategy, and we created the wealth tax, and they increased their tax commitments in a significant way. So probably those are the kind of things that can happen in the Northern Triangle that could make the whole thing kind of like be whole, and to close as a whole triangle.
Okay, any further questions? No?
Yeah,
Yeah.
hungry lunch.
Everybody wants to, let's just take one more, and I just want to ask one more too. And it's the first time that I've ever heard in this plan, in briefings of it, and I heard the ambassadors do this in DC, it raised as an explicit goal being to keep the children there. You know, I never heard that before, and I wonder if that is kind of one of the goals, if that's what's behind it to a large extent. And then my other issue is, you know, you often hear about U.S. deportation policies and how they've undermined the rule of law in these states, and whether that's been thought about at all, because, you know, a lot of the gangs, of course, are transnational gangs that began in the United States and now kind of operate more or less with impunity in a lot of communities. And I wonder if you could talk about that. Sorry, your question too, and then that'll be it. Yep, please. We can repeat it if you like.
My question is, in the participation of civil society in the whole plan, what channels are being prepared or facilitated for the involvement of civil society in this process that is very much sometimes excluded or looked at only at the community level, but more in terms of the national level and also the policies and expectations of the structural change that are happening? How will civil society be offered opportunity to participate in the plan?
Definitely, keeping the children there is a building block of the strategy, and that's been all around. And if you look at its design, it's trying to create an environment for them to stay. That doesn't mean it will guarantee it, and that doesn't either guarantee that they won't be migrating later on. Nobody pretends to really change the trends. The income gaps are enormous. If you look at the hourly wage in Los Angeles compared to any of these countries, it is pretty obvious that people will want to migrate at some point in their lives if they don't have very good employment opportunities in their home country. So that is a discussion that I believe is totally out of our leagues, and that's probably one of the most complicated issues between the United States and Central America, and is that huge wage disparity. That we don't pretend to address that, but the unaccompanied children migration seems quite troubling, and that's what it represents. And what is happening with those children in Mexico in the journey is just so scary that as just a security aspect, you should offer these children all the opportunities for them to stay. So if they want to migrate, they can do it when they can at least defend themselves, because they are incredibly vulnerable. And what has been seen is horrible things happen to them throughout that trip. So that's one of the areas where there is a lot of discussion on how at least they're going to be made aware of what they could be facing. The deportation laws in the U.S. definitely had a huge impact, and that's why the U.S. has recognized that they are part of the solution, and they are willing to budget significant amounts of money. How that deportation legislation might change in the U.S. is beyond our area of influence. One would hope things would improve, but at least we know there are dialogues in order to make the process more transparent, for the information to be given to countries, for them to know what they're getting, and for them to manage those people accordingly. But my main concern is, and I would love researchers, if some people here know how to point us out where to learn, I don't think the current system of punishment works for this kind of children and this kind of problem. Jail is not the solution, and I think there is ample evidence that people that go to jail get out probably being worse than what they were to begin with if they come from these complicated social conditions. So somebody has to come up with dramatically different strategies other than criminalize everything with income. And in the US, the trend is still to criminalize. And you have all these minimal penalties and all those jail sentences. And that, in my mind, is a huge problem. There are voices in the US that are beginning to talk about that, so one is quite hopeful that that might change. But when you look at the Congress composition and how complicated is your political process, it's going to take a long time. And regarding civil society, obviously, as a multilateral institutions, we're highly committed to create that framework. We're drafting a document that is called Strategic Engagement with Civil Society at 3 levels, communal, local, in order to gain the community dialogue on the relevant issues of the projects that are going to be implemented. At the national level, where we've had already 2 meetings in each country, we recognize that the first one was just a checklist. Unfortunately, civil society sometimes ends up being just a checklist. And, but we managed to improve the quality of the dialogue, and in the second meeting, we managed a constructive engagement with civil society. Actually took part in the design of some of the pillars, and some of the police issues in Guatemala are going to be drafted by some of the big voices in civil society. Helen Mack is helping herself on making sure that what you mentioned won't happen. And we strongly support that, and we believe that makes the whole strategy more likely to succeed. But we have to come up with like rules and regulations, and we are negotiating those as of the moment because no 1 penny has been spent yet. So we hope to get that done by December, and as I said, they're going to be made public at the IDB website and the country's website, and we're going to be hearing your comments in order to draft, hopefully, the best framework that we could to make that transparent and for you to know when information is going to be available, which are the channels for civil society to bring their opinions forward and to ask for the right changes or comments where things that could be enriched by that kind of complementarity. But as we drafted it, they are one of the key pillars, hopefully on the transparency part, but in particular to make sure that the countries improve significantly in their ability to spend resources in an effective way, because that's where they lack the most capabilities. No? They have huge budgets, and you don't see them on the ground as one would like them to be spent. So 30% of their budget is what they've committed to spend under different rules. And that has to be seen, but it's quite a huge commitment, the one they're putting forward. And we want to help them live up to the standards that they set themselves, with your help.
Thank you very much. We're going to stop now. We're going to have lunch. We're going to eat here. The next session starts at 1:30, so we don't have a lot of time, 45 minutes, 50 minutes, or whatever. And I want to thank and ask you all to thank Mr. Ortega for a terrific presentation.